For 25 years, a man had been present for every single Tonight Show taping. He'd seen every guest, heard every monologue, witnessed every historic moment. But until 1987, no one in the audience knew his name. Miguel Santos was the janitor who cleaned Studio One every morning, the invisible worker who made the glamour possible. Then Johnny Carson stopped the show, called Santos onto the stage, and asked him one question. What's it like to watch America from the shadows? Santos's answer changed how everyone understood whose work really matters. Studio One in Burbank, California, fall of 1987. The Tonight Show had been broadcasting from this space for 15 years, and in that time, it had become the most famous television studio in America. 400 seats arranged in steep tiers facing a modest stage with a desk, a rainbow curtain, and lighting that made everything look warm and intimate despite the banks of cameras and equipment. Every weeknight at 5:30 p.m., those 400 seats filled with tourists and contest winners and people who'd waited months for tickets, all of them excited to see Johnny Carson in person, to be part of the live audience for the most-watched show on television. But long before those 400 people arrived, before the cameras were positioned and the lights were adjusted and Ed McMahon took his place in the announcer chair, there was one person who was always there first. Miguel Santos, the man who cleaned the studio and prepared it for another night of entertainment that he would never be part of. Before we go deeper into what happened that fall evening in 1987, you need to understand what you're about to witness. The stories in this channel aren't about the famous moments that everyone remembers. They're about the people who made those moments possible, the invisible workers whose labor created the foundation for everything America saw on television. If you want to understand the real story behind the glamour, if you're ready to discover who actually built the world that celebrities inhabited, then subscribe to this channel. Because what happened when Johnny Carson brought Miguel Santos onto the stage in 1987 is just the beginning of understanding how much we owe to the people we never see. Miguel Santos was 62 years old in the fall of 1987, and he'd been working for NBC for 25 years, longer than Johnny Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show, longer than most of the network executives had been with the company. Santos had immigrated to the United States from Mexico in 1960 with his wife Rosa and their 2 young children, arriving in Los Angeles with almost no money and limited English, but with a determination to build a life for his family. He'd found work as a janitor at NBC in 1962, part of the overnight custodial crew that cleaned the studios after the day's filming ended and before the next day began. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but it was steady. Employment with benefits, and Santos treated it with the seriousness and pride that he would have brought to any profession. Santos's shift began at 4 a.m. every morning, 6 days a week. He would arrive at the NBC facility in Burbank while it was still dark, punch his time card, collect his cleaning cart with its mops and brooms and industrial cleaning solutions, and make his way through the warren of studios and hallways that made up the broadcast complex. Studio One was always his first stop, and it was the assignment he took most seriously. This was where The Tonight Show happened, where Johnny Carson worked, where history was made every single night. Santos understood that his job was to make the studio perfect, to ensure that when the crew arrived later in the morning to set up for that evening's taping, they would find a space that was clean and ready and worthy of the work they were about to do. The routine never varied much. Santos would start with the audience seating, wiping down every seat, checking for spilled drinks or forgotten items, making sure the aisles were clear. Then he would move to the stage itself, mopping the floor with particular care because Carson often moved around during his monologue and any dirt or debris could be visible on camera. He would clean Carson's desk, dust the guest chairs, wipe down the band's instruments and music stands. He would empty all the trash cans, clean the bathrooms, vacuum the control room. The work took about 2 hours if he moved efficiently, and Santos always moved efficiently. By 6 a.m., Studio One would be spotless, and Santos would move on to his other assigned spaces, working until his shift ended at noon. What made the work meaningful for Santos wasn't just the paycheck, though that mattered enormously to a man supporting a family on a janitor's wages. What made it meaningful was the sense of being part of something larger than himself. Santos had never been to college, had never worked in an office, or worn a suit, or done anything that American culture would classify as professional or prestigious. But every morning when he cleaned Studio One, he was contributing to The Tonight Show, to something that millions of people watched and loved. He was making it possible for Johnny Carson to walk onto that stage and do his job. That felt important, even if no one except Santos and his fellow custodians understood it that way. Over the years, Santos had developed his own relationship with The Tonight Show, though it was entirely one-sided. He would occasionally stay late after his shift ended to watch the taping from the back of the studio, standing in the shadows where the stage lights didn't reach, invisible to the cameras and the audience. He'd seen Carson interview presidents and movie stars, had watched historic musical performances, had been present for moments that would be replayed on television for decades afterward. Santos didn't speak much English when he started working at NBC, but watching The Tonight Show every day helped him learn. He would listen to Carson's monologues and try to understand the jokes, would watch the interviews and pick up new vocabulary and idioms. In a very real sense, Johnny Carson had been Santos's English teacher, though Carson had no idea Santos existed. Santos had never expected to meet Carson personally. The Tonight Show employed dozens of people: producers, writers, camera operators, stage managers, makeup artists, and Carson couldn't possibly know all of them by name. Santos was even further removed from that inner circle, part of the custodial staff that worked in the hours before and after the creative people arrived. There was an invisible line that separated workers like Santos from people like Carson, and everyone understood that line wasn't meant to be crossed. But in the fall of 1987, something happened that would change that dynamic and reveal to America the man who'd been present for every moment of The Tonight Show's Burbank era without ever being acknowledged. It started with a conversation between Carson and his longtime stage manager, Bobby Quinn. Quinn had been with The Tonight Show since the New York days and had made the move to Burbank with the rest of the production team. Quinn was the person responsible for making sure the studio was ready for each taping. And over the years, he'd developed a deep respect for the custodial staff who did the invisible work that made his job possible. Quinn knew Miguel Santos by name, knew about his family and his dedication to the work, knew that Santos had been there longer than almost anyone else associated with the show. And one afternoon in October, during a conversation about the show's upcoming 25th anniversary, Quinn mentioned Santos to Carson. Quinn told Carson about the janitor who'd been cleaning Studio One every morning since 1962, who arrived at 4 a.m. to make sure everything was perfect, who took such obvious pride in his work that the studio always looked immaculate. Quinn mentioned that Santos sometimes stayed late to watch the tapings from the back of the studio, standing in the shadows, never asking for anything, just quietly appreciating the show he helped make possible. Carson listened with genuine interest, asking questions about Santos's background and how long he'd been with NBC. When Quinn finished, Carson was quiet for a moment, then said something that would lead to one of the most memorable moments in Tonight Show history. "I'd like to meet him, and I think the audience should meet him too." The plan came together quickly. Quinn approached Santos during his shift a few days later and told him that Mr. Carson wanted to meet him and would like him to appear on the show. Santos was stunned, convinced that Quinn was joking or that there had been some mistake. Why would Johnny Carson want to meet a janitor? Why would he be invited onto the show? Quinn assured him it was real, that Carson genuinely wanted to acknowledge Santos's years of service and introduce him to the audience. Santos was terrified and honored in equal measure. He'd never been on camera before, had never spoken to a large group of people, had never done anything that required the kind of public presence that appearing on The Tonight Show would demand. But Quinn told him that all he needed to do was be himself, to walk onto the stage when Carson called him, to answer a few questions. Santos agreed, though his hands were shaking as he said yes. The taping was scheduled for late October 1987. Santos arrived at his usual 4 a.m. time to clean the studio, but this time he knew that in less than 14 hours he would be standing on the stage he was mopping, talking to Johnny Carson in front of 400 people and millions of viewers at home. The knowledge made the cleaning feel different, more significant somehow, as if he was preparing the space not just for Carson, but for himself as well. When his shift ended at noon, Santos went home to Reseda, where he lived with Rosa in a modest house they'd saved for years to afford. He told Rosa what was going to happen that evening, and she immediately started worrying about what he should wear, whether his work clothes were appropriate, or if he needed to change into something more formal. Santos decided to wear what he always wore, his gray custodial uniform with his name embroidered on the chest pocket, because that's who he was, and if Carson wanted to introduce him to America, he should see Santos as Santos actually existed. Santos and Rosa returned to the studio at 4:30 p.m., an hour before taping. Quinn met them at the entrance and took them backstage, explaining the logistics of how the evening would work. Carson would do his monologue as usual, then during the desk segment he would introduce Santos and invite him to come out. Santos should walk to the chair next to Carson's desk, shake Carson's hand, and sit down. Then Carson would ask him some questions, and Santos should just answer honestly. It sounded simple when Quinn explained it, but Santos felt his heart racing, felt the sweat on his palms, felt the overwhelming terror of being about to do something completely outside his experience and comfort zone. At 5:25 p.m., 5 minutes before taping was scheduled to begin, Johnny Carson came backstage to meet Santos personally. This wasn't part of the plan. Carson usually didn't meet guests before the show, but he'd made an exception because he wanted Santos to feel comfortable, or at least as comfortable as possible, given the circumstances. Carson shook Santos's hand, asked him a few gentle questions about his family and his work, and told him not to be nervous because the audience was going to love him. Santos, whose English had improved dramatically over 25 years, but who still spoke with a heavy accent and sometimes struggled to find the right words, managed to thank Carson for the opportunity. Carson smiled and said that it was Santos who deserved thanks, not the other way around. Then Carson headed to the stage, and Santos was left backstage with Rosa, waiting for his name to be called. The show began exactly on time at 5:30 p.m. Carson walked through the rainbow curtain to enormous applause, delivered his monologue about the stock market crash that had happened 2 weeks earlier, and interviewed his first guest, actress Kirstie Alley, about her sitcom Cheers. Santos watched from backstage on a small monitor, his stomach twisted in knots, barely processing what he was seeing because he was so focused on what was about to happen to him. Then the show went to commercial. Alley left the stage, and when the cameras came back on, Carson was sitting alone at his desk with an expression that was more serious than his usual entertainer's face. Carson began speaking about the Tonight Show's history, about how the show had been on the air for 25 years and had taped thousands of episodes. He talked about all the people who made the show possible, the writers and producers and camera operators and musicians, and how rarely those people got acknowledged publicly. Then he said that there was someone who'd been with the show even longer than most of the staff, someone who'd been present for every single Burbank taping, someone who arrived before anyone else, and whose work made everything else possible. Carson said that this person had never been on camera before, had never been introduced to the audience, had remained invisible despite being essential. Then Carson looked toward the backstage entrance and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Miguel Santos." Santos walked onto the stage and was immediately overwhelmed by the applause. 400 people in the audience were standing and clapping, responding not to his fame or his accomplishments, but to Carson's framing of him as someone worthy of recognition. Santos, who'd spent 25 years being invisible, was suddenly the center of attention in the most visible space in American entertainment. He walked to Carson's desk, his legs feeling unsteady, and shook Carson's hand. Carson gestured to the guest chair, and Santos sat down, acutely aware of the cameras pointing at him, the lights heating his face, the audience watching his every movement. Carson's first question was simple and direct. "Miguel, how long have you been working here at NBC?" Santos took a breath and answered in his accented English that he'd been there 25 years, since 1962. Carson asked what time Santos arrived each morning, and Santos explained his 4 a.m. schedule, how he cleaned the studio before anyone else arrived. Carson asked what it was like to clean the stage where so much television history had happened, and Santos said that it was an honor, that he'd always taken pride in making sure everything was perfect for Mr. Carson and the guests and the audience. The answers were simple and honest, and the audience listened with complete attention, sensing that this wasn't a typical Tonight Show interview, but something different and more important. Then Carson asked the question that would define the entire segment and create the moment that viewers would remember for decades. "Miguel, what's it like to watch America from the shadows? You've been here for every show, seen every guest, witnessed every moment, but you've always been invisible, working behind the scenes. What has that been like?" The question wasn't casual or rhetorical. Carson genuinely wanted to know, and his face showed real curiosity and respect. Santos was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, trying to find words in his second language to express something he'd never articulated before. Santos said that being invisible wasn't something he'd thought about much until recently. It was just his job, what he did, part of being a janitor. But over the years, he'd realized that there were millions of people like him in America. People who cleaned buildings and washed dishes and drove buses and did all the work that made other people's lives possible, but who never got recognized or thanked. Santos said that every morning when he cleaned Studio One, he was thinking about the 400 people who would sit in those seats that evening, and he wanted them to have a good experience, to be comfortable and happy. He was thinking about Mr. Carson and how hard Mr. Carson worked to make people laugh, and he wanted the stage to be perfect so Mr. Carson could do his job well. Santos said that his work mattered because it served other people. And that was enough. He didn't need to be visible or famous. He just needed to know that he was contributing something. The studio had gone completely quiet during Santos's answer. This wasn't entertainment in the traditional sense. This was a man with limited English and a janitor's salary explaining a philosophy of work and service that was more profound than most of the polished celebrity interviews that filled the Tonight Show's archives. Carson, who'd interviewed thousands of people and rarely seemed surprised or moved by what guests said, was visibly affected. His eyes were bright, and when Santos finished speaking, Carson was quiet for a moment before saying, "Miguel, that's one of the most beautiful things anyone has ever said on this show." The audience responded with sustained applause that lasted nearly a minute, people standing and clapping, not just for Santos, but for everyone they'd ever known who worked in visible jobs and deserved recognition. Santos looked overwhelmed, unused to this kind of attention, and Carson stood up and shook his hand again, a gesture of respect between equals despite the enormous gap in their fame and income. The segment could have ended there, and it would have been memorable. But Carson did something else, something spontaneous that wasn't planned or scripted. Carson told the audience that he'd been hosting The Tonight Show for 25 years, and in that time he'd earned a lot of money and received a lot of recognition and had a career that most people would consider incredibly successful. But watching Miguel Santos come to work every morning at 4 a.m. to clean a studio, taking pride in work that no one ever thanked him for, maintaining that dedication for 25 years, that was success of a different and more meaningful kind. Carson said that Santos had taught him something important about what work actually means when it's done with dignity and care, and he was grateful to have had the chance to say thank you publicly. Then Carson announced that he'd spoken with NBC management earlier that week, and effective immediately, Miguel Santos was receiving a substantial raise in recognition of his 25 years of service. Additionally, NBC would be establishing a small scholarship fund in Santos's name to help the children of NBC custodial workers attend college. Carson didn't mention the dollar amounts. That would have been crass, but the gesture was clear. Santos's work mattered not just rhetorically, but practically, and the network was putting money behind that recognition. Santos, who'd been holding himself together through the interview, broke down completely at that point. He started crying, not decorously, but in great shaking sobs that he couldn't control, and Carson moved from behind his desk and put his arm around Santos's shoulders, letting him cry, making no move to rush through the emotion or transform it into entertainment. The cameras kept rolling, capturing what would become one of the most replayed moments in Tonight Show history. Johnny Carson, America's most controlled and professional entertainer, standing on stage with his arm around a crying janitor, both of them representing something about class and dignity and recognition that transcended the usual boundaries of late-night television. The show eventually went to commercial, and during the break, Santos composed himself enough to finish the interview. Carson asked about his family, and Santos talked about his wife Rosa and his 2 children, both of whom had graduated from college. A point of pride that Santos mentioned with obvious emotion because he and Rosa had both left school early to work, and seeing their children achieve educational success that had been denied to them was deeply meaningful. Carson asked what Santos did when he wasn't working, and Santos said he liked to work in his garden, to grow vegetables that he shared with neighbors and family. Carson asked if Santos planned to retire anytime soon, and Santos said no, that as long as his health held up and NBC would have him, he wanted to keep working because he loved what he did. The episode aired that night at 11:30 p.m. Pacific Time, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. NBC's switchboard received thousands of calls from viewers who'd been moved by Santos's segment, many of them calling to say that they had relatives who worked in visible jobs and deserved similar recognition. The network received letters for weeks afterward, people sharing stories about janitors and cafeteria workers and maintenance staff who'd been essential to their schools or workplaces, but had never been publicly thanked. Several unions representing service workers contacted NBC to request copies of the segment to show at meetings and training sessions as an example of the dignity of their members' labor. But the most significant response came from people who worked jobs like Santos's, the custodians and housekeepers and maintenance workers who recognized themselves in his story. These workers wrote to say that Santos's appearance had made them feel seen in a way they'd never experienced before, that having their kind of work acknowledged on national television by someone as famous as Johnny Carson had given them a sense of validation they'd been craving without knowing it. One letter from a school janitor in Ohio said that after watching the segment, she'd cried for an hour because someone had finally said out loud what she'd always believed, that her work mattered, that making spaces clean and safe for other people was important, that invisible labor was still real, labor deserving of respect. Miguel Santos returned to his regular schedule the morning after his Tonight Show appearance, arriving at Studio One at 4 a.m. as he always did. But something had changed in how his co-workers and supervisors treated him. People who'd never noticed him before stopped to congratulate him, to tell him they'd seen the show, to express appreciation for his work. The dynamic had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Santos was no longer quite invisible, no longer just part of the background machinery of NBC's operations. He'd become a person, someone with a story worth knowing, and that recognition changed how people interacted with him for the rest of his time at the network. Carson never made a big public show of his relationship with Santos after that night, but those who worked at The Tonight Show said that Carson always made a point to greet Santos when their paths crossed, to ask about his family, to treat him with genuine warmth and respect. The scholarship fund that Carson had announced continued for years, helping dozens of custodial workers' children attend college. And when Santos finally retired from NBC in 1995, after 33 years of service, Carson sent him a personal letter thanking him for his dedication and wishing him well in retirement. The lesson of Miguel Santos's appearance on The Tonight Show isn't complicated. It's about the basic human need to be seen, to have our work acknowledged, to know that what we do matters even if it's not glamorous or well-paid or famous. Santos had cleaned Studio One for 25 years without expecting recognition, taking pride in work that most people would consider menial. But when Johnny Carson gave him 5 minutes on television to tell his story, something shifted, not just for Santos, but for everyone watching who did similar work and had never been thanked. The segment reminded America that every celebrity appearance, every perfect television moment, every polished broadcast is built on the invisible labor of people whose names we never learn and whose faces we never see. And sometimes, just for a moment, it's worth stopping the entertainment and saying thank you to the people who make it all possible. Miguel Santos died in 2003 at the age of 78. His family said that he'd watched the tape of his Tonight Show appearance countless times over the years, that it had been one of the proudest moments of his life. At his funeral, they played a clip of Carson introducing him to the audience, and many of the mourners said they'd cried watching it because Santos's story was their story too. Immigrants working hard in jobs that Americans born into privilege would never consider, finding dignity in labor that society dismissed as unimportant. Johnny Carson died 2 years later in 2005, and in the obituaries and retrospectives about his career, Santos's segment was frequently mentioned as one of the moments that revealed Carson's character and his capacity for recognizing worth in places where others saw only invisibility. The 1987 segment with Miguel Santos remains one of The Tonight Show's most powerful moments, not because it was funny or featured major celebrities, but because it was true. It revealed something essential about class and work and recognition in America, about how we value certain kinds of labor and ignore others, about how easy it is to forget the people whose invisible work makes our visible comfort possible. Johnny Carson, who could have spent those 5 minutes interviewing another movie star or doing another comedy bit, chose instead to give time to a janitor who'd been present for thousands of shows without ever being acknowledged. That choice said something important about Carson's values and about what The Tonight Show could be at its best, not just entertainment, but a space where America could occasionally stop and recognize the people who deserved recognition but rarely received it. Miguel Santos cleaned a television studio every morning for 25 years. Johnny Carson gave him 5 minutes to tell his story. And in those 5 minutes, both men reminded America that every job done with dignity and care is work worth honoring, regardless of how much it pays or how visible it is or how famous it makes you. Sometimes the most important people are the ones we never see, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply acknowledging that they exist. This story has been created based on documented realities of NBC's Burbank operations, the structure and staffing of Studio One during Carson's tenure, and the widespread presence of invisible labor in entertainment production. While custodial staff certainly worked at NBC during this era, and The Tonight Show occasionally featured non-celebrity guests, the specific story of Miguel Santos has been created to explore authentic themes of invisible labor, class recognition, and the dignity of service work. The purpose of this content is to honor the countless workers whose names we never learn, but whose labor makes visible success possible.